Contrary to popular belief, and as supported by the documentary, page 1 inside the New York Times, newspapers are not dead. The theme of this documentary is a newspaper's struggle to survive and thrive in the world of the internet. In 2011, the internet was growing, iPhones were becoming popular, and computers were becoming more accessible than ever before. At this time, many people were concerned that the New York Times, a strictly printed newspaper, was about to go out of business.
Newspaper model is dying. Period. Done. News is not dying.
This is the central argument of the documentary. The creator of the documentary is arguing that the newspaper model is dying, but news is not, and there is a fine line between the two.
There's no question that there is still an enormous amount of information out there, but these papers have the great capacity of a newsroom. And if you think of the history of these institutions, Watergate, Abu Ghraib, the Walter Reed scandal, it is these institutions bringing to bear newsrooms of experienced journalists. And I think we're at a dangerous moment in American journalism.
By including cutaways with notable people in the journalism field, the documentary appeals to ethos. By giving historical examples like Watergate, the documentary is appealing to logos. These appeals help support the overall argument of the film.
Please welcome David Carr. You are a former crack addict, and you are a reporter for the New York Times. Which of these two do you think is more damaging to society?
Here we meet David Carr, who we will follow throughout the documentary. Stephen Colbert, the talk show host interviewing David Carr, uses comic relief by making a joke about how being a New York Times reporter at the time was similar to his experience as a drug addict, because during this time, as the New York Times was rumored to be bankrupt, being a reporter was a difficult job to have.
If you write about the media long enough, eventually you'll type your way to your own doorstep.
This line is a synecdoche because it discusses how if you work in the media long enough as a journalist, eventually your writing will become so well known that it follows you as a person. He was writing so many articles that eventually he came across them as he would read his own newspapers at home. The typing refers to writing, and the doorstep refers to his house.
I arrived at the New York Times late in my professional life, and I have an immigrant's love of the place. The chip that was implanted in me when I arrived, let's just call it New York Times exceptionalism, leads me to conclude that, of course, we will survive.
In this clip, Carr is saying how the New York Times is inside him and it follows him everywhere and his life revolves around it, just like electronics revolve around the chips that are inside them. This is a metaphor.
So nice. Then again, having suffered through drug addiction in my 20s and 30s, landing in jail for cocaine possession, raising 2 children as a single parent, and eventually ending up at the New York Times, I know what it's like to come out the other side when the odds are stacked against you.
This clip has several purposes. First, it is appealing to pathos. We see an inside look and an anecdote of David Carr's personal life and how he had several barriers to overcome before he got to the New York Times, including drug abuse and struggling as a single parent. Additionally, he uses an analogy by saying how he knows what it's like to come out the other side, in reference to how the New York Times is currently in the same situation as he was. The New York Times' current barrier is the growth of the internet, and they need to use it as an advantage, just like David Carr did, to get where he is today.
Hello. Yes, sir. Hi, Al. Anything new on your front today? Very significant, this goddamn New York Times expose of the most highly classified documents of the war.
Oh, goddammit, I'm not going to have it. I mean, could the Times be prosecuted? Look, as far as the Times is concerned, hell, they're our enemies. I think we just ought to do it. And anyway, nobody from the New York Times is to be talked to.
The decision to publish the Pentagon Papers was the moment when the American news media stood up and said, we are independent of the presidency and we are going to do what we think is the right thing to do.
Here, the creator of the documentary made a cinematic decision to take a break from cutting from interview to interview and include B-roll footage as well as historical footage that matches the topic. This choice is vital because it keeps the viewer's attention while supporting the argument.
There's actually something called the New York Times effect. New York Times effect actually depended on the structure of analog newspaper distribution.
The New York Times effect is a metaphor of how the New York Times really does set the agenda. If they release a story on day 1, day 2, other newspapers repeat their ideas and build off of articles already printed by the Times. This shows how the world needs the New York Times, and in no way can it or will it disappear.
We're here to take note of the fact that journalism is alive and well and feisty, especially at the New York Times.
The final clip from the 2010 Pulitzer Prize announcement presents how living journalism truly is. The videographer of the documentary pans their camera outwards after the speech and shows how the room is filled with hundreds of people. Thus, journalism cannot possibly be a dying art and is instead a powerful medium that will survive and thrive for years to come.